So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a real pleasure to be here with you this morning for this session, this webinar that is a joint venture between ACA and Global Rights Nigeria. So for those who don't know, ACA stands for the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability, and ACA has been created 8 years ago by a group of civil society organizations operating across Africa. So Global Rights is one of our privileged members, and Global Rights is also part of the current ACA steering committee. So today's webinar will focus on the shared civic space, so business and human rights, and the relationship with the shrinking civic space. So I think it's self-evident that over the past few years, civic space has been under pressure. So there is a continuous trend to the shrinking of the civic space. And this is probably due to many reasons. It's not necessarily the place today to expose all these reasons, but this includes certainly the rise of authoritative governments, the rise of populism, and so on. So especially in Africa, this has been something of a great concern, at least to our organizations. And we have been working on these issues for the last few years, especially on how to protect more and more our human rights defenders. So COVID-19 has also put another level of pressure on the civic space. This is true for the rest of the world, but it is specifically true in Africa, where human rights defenders has been under attack in a way or in another. Because of the restrictions that have been adopted by many governments, it's as in a certain way eased a number of attacks or threats against human rights defenders. So I think that's where today's conversations is not only timely, but also necessary, because we are facing a huge pressure on civic space. And the question here is how we can reflect on that situation and see how businesses and civil society organizations can actually better occupy the civic space that they are both entitled to. So most of the time, the relationship between businesses and human rights defenders is a conflictual one. And our discussion today would tend maybe to reflect on how we can go beyond this conflictual relationship and try to build a relationship where every of these entities can play a significant role in the same time respecting the space of each other. So the issue that we are going to discuss today, obviously, are how best can business and human rights actually occupy the civic space in a relationship that will be built on trust. So without giving up on their respective role, how businesses and civil society can all actually accomplish their role. So the purpose of this webinar is reflect on these critical issues and building on positive experiences and positive practices. So I think, again, today's conversation is important when we think of the recovery from COVID-19. As it was mentioned very recently by the UN Special Rapporteur on on human rights defenders, a just recovery will necessarily require better collaboration between business and human rights defenders and also governments. So I'm happy that we are joined today in this discussion by prominent speakers from not only the African civil society, but also from business organizations and also from international NGOs. So I would really like to thank all of the panelists, but also all the participants. I would like especially to thank Mr. Mauricio Lazala from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center for accepting to share with us the recommendation from a very valuable report that was written by his organizations 2 years ago, and also for the work that the Business and Human Rights Resource Center is doing more generally. So I think this report is a starting point for our discussion today, and I'm happy that we have Mr. Mauricio with us. And I'm again thanking all of the panelists, and I will stop here and hand over to Funke for the rest of our conversation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benjamin, for that very robust opening remark. Good morning once again to everyone. We're really excited to be here this morning, and we're excited because we know we're going to have a very robust discourse on the issues before us today. So basically, we hope that we would have a very interactive discussion, and so we would ask that should you have any comments, any question or any opinion, you could use the chat button. So without much ado, we'll go to the first speaker. We have with us today several experts in the field of human rights and in the field of business and human rights. And we will start with Ms. Abiodun Bayewu. Ms. Abiodun Bayewu is the co-chair of the steering committee of the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability, and she's also been recently elected she's recently elected the co-chair of the Extractive Transparency Working Group for Nigeria, and she serves as the executive director of Global Rights. She's an ardent human rights defender, has done lots of projects around civic space, around business and human rights, and we're happy to have her speak to us this morning on the shrinking civic space, looking at the rationale, justifications, and implications. So thank you. Ms. Abi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Funke. Initially, when I had the conversation with you, I thought that I was making opening remarks. And incidentally, those remarks touch on the very issues you said. So I will just go ahead and read those remarks, if you will, please. So I'm very happy to be here, and I think that it's a very important conversation that we're starting today, not just having, that we're starting. This is still a very new area of business and human rights, both straddling business and straddling human rights, which a few years ago had been a very, very strange conversation. The nomenclature business and human rights itself was very strange, but then it's becoming more accepted. The conversations are growing. Speaking about the civic space on the continent in the past 10, 20 years has become more repressed. You would have thought that it would have been the military dictatorship of the 70s and the 80s that would have spoken more to the repression of the civic space. Africa's civic space has been repressed for centuries, actually, starting with colonialism, with slavery, with, and more recently, neo-colonialism. Now, in its most recent reports, Civicus, monitoring 196 countries, noted that only 3% of the world's population live in countries where core civic freedoms of association, peaceful assembly, and expression are widely respected. Of the 196 countries it monitored, 169 of them had some kind of restrictions on civil society. Even the most is the United Kingdom and the United States were indicted for limiting freedoms. In its 2020 report, it also stated that despite the protections enshrined in international law and national constitutions, people are already being excluded on the basis of their identities. International cooperation are already lacking and contested, with multilateral institutions undermined by maneuvering of powerful states, rogue leaders, anti-human rights groups, and large corporations. Samina Myrna rightly said that restrictions on civil society are the canary in the coal mine for broader freedoms of assembly, association, and expressions that are critical to stable government. Undermining civil society undermines society as a whole, and it involves us all. Africa has had more than its fair share of repression of its civic space, from colonial invasions, like I said, which were clearly economic in their objective, to modern neo-colonial incursions, which are very clearly economic in their purview. Despotic sit-tight governments across the continent continue to devise means to silence dissent and to ensure that state capture suffers no opposition. Nigeria, for example, still lives in the shadows of the atrocious killing of the Ogoni Nine and the descent of the Niger Delta into chaos that has bred the new crime of kidnapping across the country. The fiasco of Firestone's complicity in Liberia's instability still speaks volumes till today. And of course, the role that big businesses that traded in diamonds played in that country also speak to the repression of freedom of assembly, of expression, part of the things that led to the Liberian and Sierra Leonean civil wars. It is clear that governments have found even more reason to repress the civic space in the light of the current pandemic across the continent and even across the world. State capture is often at the heart of the repression of the civic space, and the unwillingness to be accountable to the electorates in semblances of democracy and the intent to squash calls for transparency and equity. This is some of the reasons why poverty remains endemic on the continent and across the world. How powerful are states and how powerful are corporations? How powerful is civil society or movements led by civil society. Can civil society ever match their might? Can they hope to wield the type of influence that states and businesses can muster in a heartbeat? Some of you may already be aware that 100 of the world's largest economies, 58 of them are states, 42 of them are corporations, and not a single CSO or civic movement can be reality of the ability to wield influence in the development discourse is hinged on this fact. But businesses have not always been the way in rights violations. For example, a lot of their actions are covered. They would not publicize them. As a matter of fact, 70% of the negotiations and the conversations that go on between government and businesses on the repression of the civic space and of rights are behind closed doors, and 70% of them will never make the headlines in any country. They're not things that are publicly spoken about. But sometimes businesses need to develop sufficient spine in the spirit of enlightened self-interest to show loyalty to their customers and think of their own long-term sustainability by speaking the truth to power. And yes, sometimes publicly. I think to the cab drivers strike in New York in 2017, when the Trump administration had decided to block the entry of people from certain Muslim countries into the United States, and the failure of Uber to also line up behind the rights-based thinking of the cab drivers, that resulted in more than 200,000 Uber accounts being canceled across the world. So how can businesses think of their role in a more just, more equitable, more right-based countries, right-based world? Do they have a role in the protection of civic freedoms? Can we appeal to their sustainability, to the fact that their sustainability and growth in the long term are hinged on the promotion of a rights-based approach, especially because they bear direct consequences on the development and the quality of life of citizens? The quality of life of citizens, of development, the semblance of equity, of right-based thinking are the very things that will be the fulcrum of sustaining businesses and ensuring that they have customers in the long run who are able to afford their goods and services. And that is why we're here today. When we have businesses that cannot be trusted by their consumers, when we have businesses that do not think long-term of their own sustainability, that are not forward-thinking on the issues of growth and sustainability, then we will have instances of unstable states, which will mean unstable business atmospheres. And in the long term, that will mean that businesses will not thrive. We've had initiatives. For example, the voluntary principles on security and human rights was birthed out of concerns around the killing of the Ogoni 9 in Nigeria. But then it would seem that in spite of the fact that this initiative has gone on for a while, that more businesses are yet to latch on to its implications and promise that it holds for businesses. There are a lot of rights abuses across countries, across supply chains, by government and by citizens. And that if we have more businesses standing up, more networks of businesses standing up, since it's safer for them to think in terms of networks standing up to speak truth to power, that will have a saner, a safer, a more just world. And I'm hoping that as other speakers will speak today, that they will allude to way forward for civil society, not just businesses, but also civil society, and what governments also need to think in rights-based approaches across the world. Thank you, and I hope that we'll have a fruitful conversation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Avi, for that. One of the very profound things I noted that you mentioned is the fact that amongst the 100 largest economies in the world, we have 58 countries and 42 corporations, and then there are no CSOs. That is profound. And it's important that we have this discourse, because going forward, we need to find a way whereby these corporations that are world powers can actually be more human rights sensitive, in the way they handle their activities. So like I mentioned earlier, please do drop your comments, your questions in the chat box. We'll still have a session where everyone could also share what their opinions are. But immediately, we would quickly move down to the next speaker. I think he's here, yes. So we have with us today Mr. Soji Apampa. He will be speaking on understanding the nexus between business and the civic space. Mr. Soji Apampa is a co-founder of the Integrity Organization. At Integrity, they are initiators of the Convention on Business Integrity, a project launched in Lagos, Nigeria, to promote ethical business practices, transparency, and fair competition in both private and the public sector. We are happy to have you this morning, Mr. Soji Apampa, and we hope that we will be able to benefit from your wealth of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Funke. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a very interesting area, because very often when you speak to business, they don't naturally see civil society as partners. And when you speak to colleagues in civil society, they very often see business as part of the problem. This is the first thing that would need to change. If we're going to leverage all the technical capacity, the economic resources, and the skills that the private sector has, and deploy it towards what we want to see to keep the civic space open. So let's start with a place like Nigeria. It is not always immediately intuitive that we have the same problems. Civil society and business in Nigeria are suffering almost the same way in Nigeria. And let me give you an example. We've done surveys on the issue of corruption. And the biggest fear that SMEs have is of the regulator. They are terrified of some of their regulators because they feel when they come for them, they have to pay. They can't stand up to them. So most of the abuses they get, it's not even, as you might imagine, just business abusing the rights of other people and so on. Sometimes it is the other way around. Even large companies, you saw the assault on MTN, was it 2 or 3 years ago, when they were fined $8.1 billion and another $2 billion on top. Meanwhile, the market capitalization on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange of the company, because of the announcement, was less than that 8.1 billion. In short, if they ever paid that fine, that would have been the end of the company. So when you see some of the things that are being done, you know that it's not in the public interest, that we're responding to some private interests. So the first point I'd like to make is that for business, we need to let them realize that they have an existential threat. If you don't speak up when they come for civil society, you're the next. You're the next. If you don't keep that space open, because I remember that what some of us did then was to start a series called Regulatory Conversations and do research and publish all sorts to try to make the central bank explain why they had taken that kind of action. So MTN in the end depended on the work of civic actors in order to amplify the problem and show that it was not in the public interest. the kind of decisions that had been taken. So there is a partnership that is required there. Recently, end of last year, the Nigeria Economic Summit put out a well-researched, well-thought-through, provocative statement in the newspapers about the way Nigeria's economy was being run, and that we were heading for the cliff, and that it wasn't in the interest of anyone, whether rich or poor. And instead, the central bank governor went against the bank MDs who were on the board of the Economic Summit Group, and threatened them, threatened that they were going to starve them of foreign exchange and some other things, and forced them to resign. Not only that, that they must never fund the Economic Summit Group again. So in terms of speaking truth to power, these are the people you are asking to speak truth to power. These are some of the largest corporations in Nigeria, also being bullied by the regulator. So I think we need to understand our context. Yes, the studies we have, and I've looked at the three of them, a lot of it is on global trends and so on, but we really need to understand the context in Nigeria in order to create a narrative that private sector can actually buy into here. Because the priorities, the big issues for business in Nigeria does not automatically correspond with the big issues for the big corporations like Google. It's not the same issues that they're facing. Their biggest issue is at the regulatory interface. So and also the way and manner in which policy is either upheld or not upheld, which is also the problem that civil society is fighting over. Because if you say no to child labor, then why are you not acting when child labor is involved? If you say no to exploitation of your people, then why are you not acting when those cases are being brought up? It's the same challenge that business is having. So the second issue is that business is very worried about the environment, the business environment in which they have to operate. That environment also impacts what civil society can do to uphold the rights, especially economic and social rights of people in this country. Again, there's a nexus, but we don't explore that nexus with business. Then business is always looking for a level playing field. You know, they don't want to really operate in a place where there's corruption. And you might think that business is the biggest perpetrator. Yes, maybe a handful manage to succeed, but the rest don't have that access to even be corrupt, even if they wanted to be. So at the end of the day, they find they cannot compete because it is tilted in favor of those with access to those in power. Now, so that is a problem also for business. It's a problem for upholding policy on the part of civil society. Because if you look at the moment at COVID-19, look at all the money that came in last year over COVID-19. I bet they didn't think that there was going to be another wave. Where is that money today? How come we're out of oxygen tanks in the country? Which country allows oxygen tanks to be traded in a black market? You know, so you look at things like that happening and you wonder, what is the business environment? What is the operating environment? And so on. So if you then go to talk to government about someone in mining that is now destroying the livelihoods of the poor and so on, well, they've sorted it out at the level of special interests already. So if we don't see that we have a common interest with the rest of business, we won't engage them. Then very often business looks at inclusive business models. So they want to reach the poor, they want to reach larger numbers of consumers and so on. And civil society very often helps to play that role. NGOs traditionally help businesses reach the last mile, the same way that they help government. Like if they're doing a vaccination program, usually the hardest to reach communities or the poorest communities are reached by the NGOs, not by the government officials or by the contractors. So we have a role to play that is really, really important, but we have a huge opportunity on our hands. Nigeria in September last year, just before October 1st, introduced a national policy on ethics and integrity. And the country outlined 7 core values for itself, which it expects business to uphold, it expects civil society to uphold, and all other groups in society. Number 1, human dignity. And if you read their casting of human dignity, it is really human rights that the government of Nigeria is saying should be part of our national ethics and integrity policy. Second is voice and participation. Strangely, straight after they brought out that policy, they were putting down the NSAS movement, but it is there. It was signed off by the president himself. So we have a tool there. Number three, patriotism, not just by individuals, also by corporates. So it's to get business to interpret all of those values. And let me reel them out very quickly. Personal responsibility, integrity, national unity, professionalism. So all of these, this is now the year of implementation for the National Ethics and Integrity Policy. So this is the time to engage with the ICPC, to engage with private sector, and to partner to look at how to define implementation of those values, because there's going to be a consequence management framework with it as well. So yes, we've got an inroad with the National Human Rights Commission, but now it's being opened even more through this National Ethics and Integrity Policy. So if I have 1 minute, because I know you're tight for time, if I have 1 more minute, let me talk about what it says under the shared space under pressure. Number
Please
one,
go ahead.
yes, that we will understand, we should understand the reality and severity of the harms to civic freedom. And in Nigeria, I don't know if you've been following the NGO bill that they tried to introduce a number of times, which they've snuck in again. There's another version of it now going through the National Assembly, a social media bill, and also this hate speech bill. If you read the content, you'll see that it's designed to actually muzzle civil society and the civic space. It would totally shrink it if any of these bills become law. So it's very important that we know that, and we help business to understand how that impacts them as well. We need, secondly, it says establish the degree of company involvement. So except you can cast it as an existential threat for business, you might not really catch their attention. And after you catch their attention, you have to show them what to do, because this is an area in which they don't have expertise. They may have expertise in everything else, but in knowing how to engage, and to engage in this space is not an area in which they have a lot of experience, especially in Nigeria. Thirdly, we should identify the forms of action that will maximize impact on civic freedoms. Again, that suggests collaboration, it suggests collective action, which we should look at. Then we should be able to also furnish them with risks of action and inaction. What will happen if they were to do something or not to do something? And I think at the end of the day, yes, it says finally who decides, but I think these things call for action already on their own when you see that your ability to do business, your ability to maintain a social license to continue to do business will be severely impaired if you don't act, especially if the government is then able to close the space. Because what the central bank tried to do to stop the Economic Summit Group from talking about macroeconomic issues that affect all Nigerians, which they resisted. And I'm glad they resisted and stood up to the central bank and all its bullying. Okay, I'll leave it here for now. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mr. Sojia Pampa, for bringing in the Nigerian perspective to these issues. And the interesting thing is, even though, yes, we have all of these legislations that you have mentioned, like the NGO bill, the social media bill, and all these legislations that are intended to restrict the civic space in Nigeria, it's also prevalent in other parts of the world currently. You know, in Uganda, for instance, prior to the elections, there was this constriction of the use of social media. We know what's happening in Tanzania currently. So this actually goes beyond, you know, what is happening in Nigeria to other parts of Africa. And I love that you stressed on the need to help, the need to help the businesses and corporations see this nexus. I really do hope, I know we have a session on the strategies, actual strategies we would be using to create, to help businesses see this nexus between this nexus on why this matters to them. I hope that we would have actual strategies on that as we go forward. So quickly, we have a few minutes for comments, for questions, for anything. So you could just, like we mentioned, you could just put that in the chat box or unmute yourself and share your thoughts on what we have heard so far from Abby and then from Mr. Sojia Pampa. While we, okay, so Mr. Sojia Pampa has given us a background looking at the Nigerian, the Nigerian situation. We will be having Mr. Mauricio Lazala in a few minutes, but before then, we will just give room to a few questions. I have some questions already, but then I think I'll just wait for a few seconds if anyone has any comment, any question, any thoughts, any opinion so far. Okay. Okay, so in the absence of that for now, I believe that we are writing down our questions and then after. Oh, okay, so Mr. Soji has to leave soon. So please, if you have any question for him, you might want to ask. So I have a question for you, sir. I have a question for you, although my question is tied down to one of the next sessions. But then I'm really particular about how do human rights organizations help businesses to create this nexus. We as an organization, for instance, we have in many of our previous events, you know, tried to reach out and we are still reaching out to them. But then there's this sort of disconnect, like they don't see these things the way we see them. And then, so many times they just wait for very big situations like the CBN issue you mentioned to happen before they see that, oh, we actually have a role to play. So in your practice, how have you been able to help corporations and businesses see the nexus and see why they should be actually involved in, you know, this human rights and how to ensure that the civic space is left open?
Okay. The first thing is that whatever we talk to them about, we have to show the link to their bottom line.
Okay.
Some of the larger companies understand a triple bottom line, and therefore it's easier because they're looking at people, profits, and planet. They can understand that, but many of those that are not the larger companies or the international companies don't understand the triple bottom line, and it's just the financials. So whichever one it is, we try to link the situation to their bottom line. So for instance, if the rights of some of the smaller users of the ports is being affected, I want to show the big companies how their fortunes are being damaged if they don't join in with the smaller companies now to support the reforms and the call for the reforms that need to be done. So it's not always overt. Sometimes they just fund a study or they fund some research, but they do something to move the work forward. Sometimes, like we introduced the corporate governance rating system. The reason why many of them took to that rating system was because it came up at a time where they would try to raise money internationally, but because of the corruption record of the sovereign, which is the country, they do not get a warm reception internationally to raise money. So they were all looking for, how can I show that I'm not part of the rot? And that was the way we positioned the rating system, that they could use it to rebrand themselves and also show how they were different and what practical things within their companies they have actually done not to do business as usual. So it gave them a tool, and therefore it was something they could embrace because it was helping their journey to their bottom line, but it gave us the kind of insights and data that we wanted from them. So there is a lot of work we have to do to think through and put ourselves in their shoes and then craft messaging that would make it attractive to them to even sit at the table with you.
Very, very much for that, Mr. Soji Apampa. I love the last thing you said. You said we have to craft messaging that is attractive to them. So basically the messaging we're giving to the government has to be totally different from what we send across to the business, the corporation. And because they are interested in profit, they are interested in the bottom line, we have to help them see how all of these issues relate to their bottom line at the end of the day. Wow, that is very, very insightful. Thank you very much, Mr. Soji. I don't know if anyone has any question again for him before he has to run down for another rescheduled meeting. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Soji. We are happy and glad that you were able to join us today, and we hope to continue further engagements with you. I want to mention that this webinar is just the beginning of a new conversation. Like Dr. Benjamin had mentioned during the opening remark, we are not just here to speak. There is a need for action at this time, and everything that we would be discussing during this webinar, we would actually put them into action to ensure that there is the relationship between corporations and civil society in opening up the civic space, is ongoing. So we would move right ahead to our next speaker. We're already a bit pressed for time, so I'm just going to quickly read the bio of Mr. Mauricio Lazala. We're very happy to have you. Mr. Mauricio Lazala is the Deputy Director and the head of the Europe office of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And so there is a particular report that we are looking at today, the Shared Space Under Pressure, Business Support for Civic Freedom and Human Rights. And Mr. Mauricio contributed to that report. So today he will be sharing with us recommendations, basically. So welcome, Mr. Mauricio Lazala. We are happy to have you. You can, yes, over to you.
Great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Funke. Thank you very much to ACA and to Global Rights Nigeria for inviting me to speak to you all today. I hope you can hear me fine, but let me know if there is any issues with the connection. It's great to be talking about this issue with you all today. It's an issue that we at Business and Human Rights Resource Center have been working for at least 5 years now, if not more, but 5 years really dedicated to the issue of, as we call it, civic freedoms, human rights defenders, and the role of business. Just to give you a very quick, I was asked to speak for 15 minutes, so I will do my best to stick to the time. To give you a very, very quick introduction to the Resource Center, just for you who don't know us. We are an international human rights NGO exclusively dedicated to the issue of business and human rights. We've been around for about 20 years now. We work on issues of transparency, on issues of accountability, and issues of empowerment. At the moment, our website covers over 10,000 companies around the world in 180 countries in 8 different languages. So anyone can go there and look for a company that you are interested, and then you'll get a list of news, articles, reports, and information on the negative and positive human rights impacts of the company in question. We operate with a network of colleagues around the world. And I just want to mention that we have 4 people based in Africa. We have a person in Senegal, another person in Kenya, another person in South Africa, and another person in Tunisia. And with my colleagues there, we call them regional researchers and representatives. We really are trying to cover all those sub-regions of the continent and be close to where the abuses take place, close to where civil society is operating, also where companies are operating. And these regional researchers around the world are really the backbone of our organization. And we are very proud to be able to operate in this decentralized manner. Great that I have 20 minutes. Thank you, Funke. I'd like to start my presentation today with a short PowerPoint that I presented. Can we put it up, please, if it's possible? While we put that up, I'll mention that, you know, the introductions from Benjamin, from Abby, and from the speaker which we just had already touched on many of the issues that I wanted to touch. So that's great because that saves some time. These reports that I'm going to be mostly talking about, called the Shared Space Under Pressure, it was really Shared Space Under Pressure, Business Support for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders. It was a report that ourselves, together with another NGO called the International Service for Human Rights based in Geneva, we commissioned that to an external consultant called Bennett Freeman. Some of you may have heard about Bennett Freeman because he was behind the creation of the voluntary principles on security and human rights, which Abby mentioned before. And in the writing of this report, he interviewed over 90 leaders in civil society, in business, and in governments to be able to inform the report with the best policy and practice from all these sectors and make the most useful recommendations for the readers of the report. Thank you. I see the presentation is now up there. When we wrote this report, we were working, and we are still working, with a group that we call the Business Network for the Protection of Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders. This is a group of about 30 multinationals around the world that are really the leaders in the field of protecting civic freedoms and human rights defenders. As Mr. Soji just said before that, there is an issue of trust between civil society and business. That's not secret. We are all very much aware of that. But there are also examples of companies that have taken action and spoken up in support of what you have been calling the civic space, and speaking up on behalf of human rights defenders. And we wanted to understand why those companies have done that, and what can we do to leverage that example and replicate that example in other cases, in other circumstances. As Avi said, and Civicus shows very well, the situation of civic space and civic freedoms around the world is dire, is very, very complex and very concerning at the moment. There are restrictions popping up almost on a daily basis somewhere else around the world. And therefore, civil society needs all the allies that they can get to help protect themselves, defend themselves, and fight for that open environment in which to carry out their work in a free and fair manner. So if we look at the second slide, Abby already mentioned the Ogoni 9 case. So this is just to show you that this is not a new agenda. We recently commemorated 25 years since the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni 9 in Nigeria. And since then, there's been allegations of collusion between companies and governments in the repression of civil society, most dramatically when it ends up in killings and disappearances like in the case of the Ogoni 9, but also when we refer to other types of attacks against human rights defenders, and I'll show you that in a moment. If we go to the third slide, please. Then we see here that, as Mr. Soji was saying, business and civil society actually both share the same space. It's the non-governmental space, so the space that is not government. But it's not just in theory, it's also in practice. Soji said that already, so I won't expand much on this issue, but both business and civil society benefit from a strong rule of law, from accountable government, from an environment where free speech is respected. Business wants free speech, to have media, to have a check on corruption, on transparency. Civil society wants the same thing. Civil society wants to have an environment in which they can freely associate and assembly and express themselves. And these elements are also the same elements that are important for stable, profitable, sustainable business and predictable business. You know, businesses are always interested in environments where they can predict, so they can do business plans and they can hire people for the future, invest in research and development, etc. They need stability for that. They need social peace for that. Well, civil society is interested also to bring prosperity to everybody, also to the poorest in society and to the most marginalized in society, and have peaceful environments. So here I have a quote from Mariam Al-Kawaja, a very prominent human rights activist from the Gulf, in which she says, to businesses, if you're going to do business in any country, ask where their human rights defenders are. If you find that they are all in prison, that is going to be an economy that you don't want to be part of. And time again, we have seen that companies that enter societies where there is high degrees of repression against civil society, most of them end up regretting that decision later on. Of course, there are some unscrupulous, very, very unscrupulous companies that exist, that's the reality, and that they go into these very repressive states in collusion with the government, and they profit from the state of affairs. We want to see that that's a very tiny minority, and we want to put pressure on those companies to stop doing that as well. And there are mechanisms with investors and others, and that is already happening. Of course, there will also be lawsuits against this company, and the Democratic Republic of Congo is a good example where we have seen a number of lawsuits being filed in national and international courts against companies that profited from the civil war there. And there are even attempts to bring some of these companies to trial at the International Criminal Court and their individual liability and responsibility for the crimes committed there. Let's go to the next slide. And then we see there that, as I was saying before, we at the Resource Center, we have a database of attacks against human rights defenders that operate on corporate accountability issues, business and human rights issues. Unfortunately, we have already registered over 2,700 attacks against human rights defenders in the last 5 years all around the world. Many of these cases also occur in Africa. As you see here, 572 attacks were registered in the database just in 2019. We are right now processing and analyzing the numbers of 2020, of last year, which I suspect has also seen an increase in the attacks against human rights defenders. This is a very concerning situation. And it is concerning also for the companies that work with us in the business network for civic freedoms and human rights defenders. This is just one example of many. Berta Cáceres from Honduras, who was assassinated. It was 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, 2.5, 3 years ago in Honduras, after she raised concerns about the impacts of a hydroelectric dam in the lands of her indigenous community in Honduras. And the fact that she was a former winner of the Goldman Environmental Prize did not help her and did not protect her. Let's go to the next slide, please. So that is like the negative situation at the moment. On the more positive side, I wanted to show you a few examples of companies that actually have supported civic freedoms and human rights defenders. So Adidas, for example, Adidas was the first company in the world that adopted a human rights defenders policy. Not only a human rights policy, many companies have human rights policies, and some of them are good, some of them are less good, but Adidas adopted a specific policy on human rights defenders, on defending and protected human rights defenders. And not only the policy, but they also have acted on that policy. I don't usually compliment a lot of companies because we in our work cover misconduct and misbehavior by companies on a daily basis, and it's very difficult to find positive cases. But this is really a case in which we have seen the company taking steps in Vietnam, in Cambodia, to protect civic freedoms and to protect human rights defenders. They're acting on their policy. There are other examples here. I don't have the time to tell you about all these examples, but I will tell you a little bit more about the one that you see at the bottom of the slide there, Tiffany and Company, because this relates directly to Africa, and it is actually the case that prompted us to investigate all these issues more deeply. This was the case of a prominent independent journalist in Angola called Rafael Marquez. You may have heard of him. He had been writing for many years about abuses happening in the diamond mines of Angola. And after one of those reports in 2015, where he described horrible, horrible human rights abuses that were committed by the private security guards of these diamond companies in the mines and around the mines against artisanal miners that had been mining the rivers there for centuries. After one of these reports, the diamond companies actually sued Rafael Marquez for supposed libel, defamation, and he was facing the prospect of 10 years in jail over these trumped up allegations, claims that were untrue. So a lot of NGOs in Africa and around the world gathered together to support Rafael Marquez. In his case, they wrote letters to the government, they made a campaign to free him. But the company wasn't backing down. The government itself was made by some ministers who were former military people who had shares in the diamond companies and in the private security companies that were the target of Rafael Marquez's report. So they didn't have any interest in going easy on Rafael Marquez. So we thought, what else can we do if these NGOs are already writing to the government and it's not having much effect? What else can we do to put pressure on the government to release Rafael? And we thought, why don't we write to the diamond companies themselves and ask them if they want to have a say on the issue? To make a long story short, three companies finally made a statement. One of them was Tiffany and Company, which is a very well-known diamond company in the world, in which they themselves wrote to the government and said that they support Rafael Marquez, they stand behind him, and they call on the government to immediately release him. He was released indeed. His 10 years in jail were commuted for 6 months suspended sentence. And after some time afterwards, when I met Rafael in Geneva in one of the UN forums on business and human rights, he told me that the statement from Tiffany had actually made a difference and had helped his case there. So this is an example of how companies can use their reputation, their influence, their leverage to support a human rights defender that's needed. I think we may have lost the slides, but never mind. I'm in my last 7 minutes of the presentation. I wanted to mention also that the COVID-19 crisis, as the previous speakers also mentioned, unfortunately has been used as a pretext by many governments to further restrict civic freedoms, including freedom of association, assembly, and expression. And therefore, we now more than ever need to be with our radar well open and well tuned to detect these kind of attempts and resist them, act against them. So, how should companies really address this issue? In the report, in the Shared Space Under Pressure report, we make 3 cases to companies to take seriously this issue: the normative case, the business case, and the moral case. The normative case is basically to repeat what is already in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It very clearly says there that when a company has been linked or has caused harm, they have the obligation to act to remedy that harm. So there is no need to expand on that, but there is not only when they are linked or cause the harm, there is also an expectation for them to take a stand on any issues that relate to their industries, their supply chains, their sector, their staff. So the guiding principles really is a floor and not a ceiling. So there is discretionary space for companies to do many more things. There is also the business case. Already the previous speaker, Mr. Soji, spoke about that, so I won't go further into that. And there is a moral case for companies to do the right thing. And as he was saying also, I want to emphasize this point about the risks of action and the risk of inaction. Nowadays, companies may face even greater backlash and greater negative consequences if they do not take action as if they took action. We live in the world of social media. We live in the world of immediate news. If a company stays silent for too long, they may be facing more harmful consequences than if they do something. And we have seen that in the case of United Airlines in the US, in the case of Nike, in many cases that I can go more into depth later if there is time. Finally, so what should companies do? There is a spectrum of actions. Not always taking public action is the right thing to do. Sometimes if they go behind closed doors and they do private representations with the government to say to a government, you know what, it is not helpful what you are doing. You should let these people out of jail, or you should stop the repression of striking workers, for example, which is actually a real life case that happened in Cambodia. That could have more important positive results for the human rights defenders in case. But sometimes it is about taking public positions, public stands, and issuing statements like Tiffany did, a letter to the government, a public letter to the government that makes the difference. Also, the companies can operate individually, but can also operate collectively. And we have seen actually multi-stakeholder initiatives like the EITI, like the Fair Labor Association, like the Ethical Transparency Initiative, like the Global Network Initiative, and others taking collective action in support of civic freedoms and human rights defenders. Sometimes actually for companies it's easier to get together with other companies in support of these issues. I think I have 2 more minutes. And in those circumstances, we have seen that governments react. There is also an option of working with investors. And investors is a new area that is poorly understood, to be honest, in civil society, but actually has huge, huge influence, both on companies that they invest in and on the governments where they are.
I don't know, if it's here, but Mr. Mauricio, we can't hear you.
Really?
We can hear you. I think it's your network.
The line is breaking off in beats.
I think it's your network, Funke. We can actually hear Mauricio.
Ah, yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, I can hear you all very well. So I hope you can hear me. I see that also the PowerPoint came back. If we can move to the last slide, I am basically in the last slide already. Thank you. And talking about the possible actions that can take place there, and I would lastly want to address the issue of trust. I completely understand. We completely understand civil society that has reservations when they are asked to partner or collaborate with companies on any of these issues. Fully understood that. I would just say that a couple of things. One is that if you partner with a company or with a group of companies to protect a specific civic space issue, for example, to resist one of the bills that are going on in the Nigerian parliament at the moment, that does not mean that you are endorsing the company for everything that they do. For example, in our work with the Business Network on Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders, we do encourage them to take positive actions in support of civic freedoms and human rights defenders. But we tell them very clearly, if the next day you are found to be abusing human rights in another country, we're gonna come to you and we're gonna ask you to respond publicly to those allegations of abuses. So working in this manner does not give you a carte blanche, they say in French, to go and abuse human rights the next day somewhere else. That is very clearly the message, and it's important, and companies accept that, and at least the progressive companies accept that and understand that that's not the case. And the second thing to mention is that we live in very dangerous moments, and civil society needs all the help and all the partners that they can get. And it is not us telling civil society to do this partnership. It is human rights defenders themselves. They come to us like Rafael Marquez, like some people in Central America and some people in other parts. They come to us and they say, can you please help us find a company that can support in these efforts to resist the restrictions of civic space? And that's why we do it. I'm gonna share here in the chat an article that the Fund for Global Human Rights, which I think supports many NGOs in Africa, actually wrote to civil society saying, consider partnering with businesses when and if makes sense, when and if it's necessary to resist the closing of civic space. In the interest of time, I will leave it there, and I thank you again very much for inviting me to talk with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mauricio. For the last part of while you were speaking, I don't know, I had some little issues with my network. I was just trying to get back. We actually do have some time on our hands, so we would still like to hear you share some thoughts on actual strategies that we can use to close up the gap between corporations and businesses. But before between corporations and CSOs, can you hear me? My network is pretty unstable.
Yes, we
can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Okay,
we can hear
okay,
you.
okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I've had some direct messages already saying people have questions, they have comments. So before we go into that, I would like to have a sense of who our organization and the country from which we're in the call, and then go straight to the questions and comments on the presentation so far. So I would start. Just type in your name, the organization you're representing, and the country from which you're joining the webinar.
It seems Funke's network is unstable.
Okay. I had to just change. Still muted. Okay. I had to change my network. Sorry about that. Okay.
Unfortunately, it would seem Funke's network is unstable, and she is currently out of the meeting, as it seems Ben is also out of the meeting right now. I think for the same reason. I think that we can continue the conversation until they return. And so if anyone has questions for Mauricio, you could just raise your hands or.
Hello. Hello. So this is Funke. I don't know. My network is really upsetting me. I've been speaking. I didn't know I was already locked out. So, but basically, so what we have right now is we have a forum for questions, for thoughts on all that has been shared from Mauricio's presentation. Please, can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes, we hear you, Funke.
So we have.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I can see from the chat box that we have people from Nigeria, from the UK, from South Africa. Okay, so let's share thoughts on all that we've discussed so far. What's the situation like in your country? What's the situation like what's your experience in terms of all that we've discussed so far? Where is it? And I wanted to know if, so for Mrs. Ojia Pampa had to step out, but then we still have Abby. Dr. Benjamin also mentioned to me that he's having some power issues. So I don't know, Abby, if you want to share thoughts on what Mr. Mauricio had mentioned, the presentation. Do you have any thoughts to share concerning that, or any comments, additional comments? Okay.
Well, thank you again, Funke. I think that Mauricio has made a wonderful presentation. Just a second. Mauricio has made a wonderful presentation, and that is giving us a lot of food for thought. In the UN principle, the principle of do no harm, ensuring that you also remedy violations is very important. Between him, juxtaposing his presentation with Saji's presentation is stopping to think really about the concerns of businesses, of not being perceived as being anti-government, and so as not to jeopardize their ability to carry on business. But yet at the same time that they realize that their loyalty should also be to their customers, while they would like to say that, you know, we're just in here to make profit, but that they have a moral duty to ensure the respect for human rights. And it's rightly said, and I think I alluded to this earlier, that one of the ways in which businesses can successfully engage in a rights-based approach and ensure that they're also actively engaged publicly in the quest for human rights is also to work in networks, to have associations through which they speak. And that the example of the Kimberley process is one of the ways in which the issues of Sierra Leone and Liberia were brought in businesses to do this. And also pointing out the example of Nike and their stand on the Colin Coupling's issue is another very, very great example. I also think that it's very important to also point out that businesses can also think of the ways in which their foundations can reward respect for human rights. For example, you had the Goldman Sachs award, the Green Nobel, going to Brownwell in Liberia at the highest point of the persecution that he suffered from businesses and government, and how that brought the entire conversations, turned the conversation around to bring more issues, to bring more light on the issues of human rights violations in the environmental space in Liberia. And so, yes, I also think that Mauricio also spoke about something that was very important, and I was away for part of the call. My internet went out, which was that the hesitation of civil society to engage business, which is when you think that we often reject the monies that businesses are willing to offer us, and rightly so. And it's also about perception and narrative that we create in those stands, but that we should think of support as not just in terms of monetary terms, but in terms of background support for issues. For example, like you had for the Ogoni 9, resulting in the voluntary principles for security and human rights, like you would have for issues like the 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 multi the large companies in Nigeria offering support palliatives for COVID, but then being able to challenge government as to accountability for COVID spending and to the respect of rights on COVID. Having the Bar Association, for example, speak more truth to power about the current Companies and Allied Matters Act in Nigeria might also be another issue that we might want to think about. But I think that colleagues in the room and across the continent may also have instances that they would like to speak about or challenges they have with the solutions that Mauricio has posited. So.
That let's do that it's like the something animation on a remote so that one has it was not gotten back to me.
Shimwa, your mic is on. Could you please turn that off?
Thank you very much, Abby. So we already have some comments and some questions. So I'm going to read that of Kwadumdi John Oko. So he says, I think businesses need to know that respect for human rights is just the right step for them to increase relevance and maximize profits. Happy people, happy businesses. Thank you for that, Mr. John. So I think we already agree on this. So the question going forward is, what are the actionable strategies? What are the practical steps we can bring in to help businesses understand this? So before I read out Mr. Valentine's notes, I have a question here for Mr. Mauricio. It was sent to me via direct message. So it says, how can we encourage businesses to come in to speak about the shrinking civic space, or at least put out statements considering that their actions can make a change?
Okay, you want me to respond right away, or you want to collect a number of questions first?
Okay. So that's
whatever
about the only question I have. Yeah, you can just go ahead. So the next speaker we just confirmed that the next speaker unfortunately would not be around. She has sent in messages to Dr. Benjamin, so we have some time on our hands to discuss these and have a very interactive session.
Okay.
Yes. So,
great. So I'll address that question, and I think Abby also alluded to that issue of how to encourage businesses to actually take these steps. And you are completely right. Companies most of the time are not used to speak out about human rights issues. They are not in this field. They are not human rights defenders, and they actually, many of them are wary of getting involved in human rights issues because they perceive that as a political issue. And as you all know, they are hesitant to antagonize the governments in which they are operating. They want the license to operate from the governments. However, there is also a social license that is increasingly important for companies to have, and that is the license that society at large, beyond government, gives companies. For example, for extractive companies, that social license is crucial because they need the agreement of the local communities if they want to operate successfully without protest, without opposition, without issues that may increase cost or delay operations, etc. So that social license is also very important. So business do sometimes have to walk this tight balance to have acceptance from both of them, and therefore many of them are reluctant to speak out openly and publicly about human rights issues perceived as political issues. It is true. We are all the time in that constant struggle to convince more companies to do things nevertheless. So one of the things we have learned in this doing this work is that companies are more likely to do something if they join together with other companies than if they are alone. Asking a company to alone issue a big statement or oppose the government publicly is very unlikely to result in something concrete. But if you ask a number of companies to do it, they are more likely to take action because they will fear less any repercussions, every consequences from the government against themselves. And that's what happened in Cambodia when 6 textile companies got together to call on the Cambodian government to respect the rights of striking workers and freedom of association of striking workers. Because all of those 6 companies together represented about 80 or 90% of the collective textile industry in the country. So the government is very unlikely to want to, throw out of the country 90% of the companies that generate revenue in their textile sector, right? Especially a sector that is so important for the Cambodian economy, like the textile one. So that is one strategy to encourage companies to work together. Another strategy is to show companies that they can do things in a diplomatic manner that still benefits civil society, but doesn't necessarily antagonize government. For example, give funding for civil society. That's not a political statement, but that helps civil society a lot. Or, for example, IT companies, Microsoft is a good example in which they have offered digital protection software and tools for free to civil society in their attempt to protect civic space and increase the ability of civil society to defend themselves from digital attacks. Anyone, by the way, can go to Microsoft and if you're a registered NGO, you can get this software called Account Guard for free for them, which for other clients, it costs a lot. And a third strategy that I would mention, Abby mentioned customers. Customers are very important for companies. Yes, that is true. Unfortunately, as we all know, not every company has customers in the sense of like individual customers. There are companies that are business to business software, or just their customers are only governments. For example, Trafigura, big oil services companies. Their clients are other oil companies and governments, not like the regular customer on the street. How do you leverage those companies that don't have a public face? These are huge companies, but no one has never heard of them because they don't sell to consumers. Well, use investors, because they do have investors. Even if they don't have consumers, they do have investors, and the investors increasingly have more ethical concerns. And there is a huge rise in what is being called the ESG investment, environmental, social governance investment. Now, these investment trusts that have ESG considerations are managing trillions and trillions of dollars of assets, and they have to screen their companies much more strictly on environmental, social, and governance issues. So you can use these investors, pension funds, for example, the Norwegian pension fund, they regularly disinvest in companies that are involved in human rights abuses. So use these investors to put pressure on companies. And another leverage of pressure on companies is their own employees. You may know this example, but Google was developing a search engine for China that was censored, that was kind of a self-censored search engine to be able to operate in China. And they also were developing a software for the Pentagon in the USA that was going to increase the capacity of the Pentagon to spy on citizens. Well, both of these business development ideas fell down, were canceled, and were shelved. Why? A lot of that was due to pressure by the own employees of Google that organized, mobilized, wrote to the senior manager saying that they were opposed to developing a sensor search engine and a spyware software, and Google had to back down and shelve those initiatives, their own employees putting pressure. So that increasingly is also taking place. So these are all ideas and ways to put pressure on companies for them to take action or to encourage company action, despite the fact that it is difficult to convince them to take action on these issues.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. That's quite expansive, and I love particularly the first point you made concerning the need for them to work together, because going just alone, they will not be able to effect as much change, as going as a coalition or as many people. So we have a comment here for you with respect to your earlier presentation from Valentine Kunuji. It says, very interesting presentation. I just wanted to chip in that there is an increasing recognition of the role of financial institutions in institutionalizing respect for human rights by corporations, known as sustainable finance. That is by withholding financing from corporations that have breached human rights or projects that would potentially or inevitably violate human rights, or ensuring that loan agreements include covenants that oblige corporations to avoid violation of human rights. So that's a comment from Valentine Kunuji. You want to say something on that?
Yeah, so this, thank you very much, Valentine. This goes along what I was just mentioned about environmental, social, and governance responsible investment. It is also called sustainable investment by other names. It is true, it's not only in pension funds and in asset managers and big investment firms, it's also the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and multilateral financial institutions that have these more stricter sustainable or ESG criteria before they give the loans to different business projects that they work. So that is another place where civil society has been operating. Some of you in your organizations may know that there is a coalition, it's a coalition called the Coalition for Defenders in Development. And that is exactly what they do. They lobby and put pressure on international financial institutions to consider human rights more seriously in their investment decisions and in their loan decisions. So, if you don't know them, I'd be happy to share with you the contact details of this coalition. You can work with them to put pressure on these financial institutions to consider human rights issues. And again, exactly, sustainable finance, as Valentine is saying, is on the growth, is increasing a lot nowadays. And more banks as well, private banks, are going into this field and considering these issues more closely. Of course, we need to be critical in the sense that some of these investments that are called ESG investments are very light, very soft. So, for example, they're mostly focusing on environmental issues, because environmental issues are easier to measure, are easier to demonstrate that you are doing something, and they are less focused on human rights issues or social issues. So it is important to also be discerning and look into the details of the indicators and of the policies of some of these investments that are called socially responsible investments, and actually see which ones are taking the social aspect of ESG more seriously than others, and perhaps focus on those and work with those to put pressure on the companies to take action in these issues. And again, we can help you with that. We have some expertise that we have developed in that. My colleagues in Africa or my colleagues elsewhere can help you a lot with these activities, this lobbying and this campaigning.
All right. Thank you, Mauricio. So I have a question, and it's been going through my mind while you were speaking, Mr. Mauricio, and I would like if Abby can also share thoughts about this. So many of these corporations always are looking at the political and reputational risk associated with getting involved in human rights. And I think it was earlier on, someone had mentioned that it's all about the baseline for them. So how do we help them to see that while they're trying to preserve their reputation and cover up for these political risks, also engaging in these conversations is very, very important for their businesses.
Yeah. So I would mention to them, first of all, as I said in my presentation, that there are also risks of inaction. And a good example of that was, you may remember, I think like about a year and a half ago, there was a video on social media that went viral, and it was the security guards getting inside a plane of United Airlines and removing forcefully a passenger there. They actually grabbed him and dragged him along the corridor of the plane, and everybody was shouting and opposing that measure, but they actually dragged him and put him out of the plane because they had overbooked the plane. This was before COVID. They had overbooked the plane, and they were just asking for people to give away their seats, and no one wanted to give away the seats, so they just went and took this poor man and dragged him out of the plane, which was outrageous. But the CEO of the company didn't say anything. He stayed silent, probably because of exactly the calculations that Funke is talking about. He thought that it's better to let this thing go by, not say anything. Profit is always the most important, and if I don't say anything, maybe this thing will disappear, and we just continue with our business as if nothing happened. Well, he was completely wrong, because the video went viral on social media. Everybody was talking about this issue. It went on all the news channels, and the investors starting to put away their money from United Airlines. The share price of the company fell by 25% in 3 days. We are talking about billions and billions of the value of the company being wiped out of the stock market in 3 days because of the scandal. So at the 4th day, he did come out, the CEO come out and apologize to the person, say that they will pay compensation, etc., etc. That was too late. Already the share price has gone down for 25%. It recovered a little bit, but it still was down from before the scandal. So this is an example to show companies there are perhaps even more dangerous if you don't say anything, if you stay quiet in front of these kind of things. And the other thing I would say is to companies, for them to convince them is what we mentioned before: the importance to keep consumers happy, the importance to keep employees happy, the importance of keeping investors happy, the importance to have a social license to operate and have reputational rewards. Companies that do this kind of thing, for example, Tiffany did that letter on behalf of Rafael Marquez, and nothing happened to the bottom line. The bottom line was not affected. Actually, they managed to attract more of this sustainable investment into their company, more ESG investment, because investors started seeing them as a more responsible company, a company that was really taking seriously their human rights policy, their code of conduct policy, and their policies that many times are very nicely written, but they are not translated into action. This is an opportunity for companies to translate into action many of the things that they have said in writing or publicly, but it's just talk. Until they don't do something, until they don't walk the talk, they cannot actually demonstrate that they are seriously about these issues. So they have a lot of opportunities and rewards to be gained by taking these things more seriously.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mauricio. I don't know if there are any questions, any further comments. Okay, there is a comment here. We'll be reading it. Okay, so okay, Ramatu Umar says basically human rights should be mainstreamed into business practices as a matter of policy. Yes, there are several policies already, like the one earlier mentioned. Knowledge today, and someone had asked earlier for your website. You can visit resources on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. I would type in the website again. There are more resources on business and human rights on the website, and we hope that we will continue these conversations going forward. If there's a question, okay. Yes.
That's the
The
website.
website is, yes, thank you very much, Mr. Mauricio. So thank you so much. Yes. So I hope we've had a very insightful session today. I hope we've taken notes. I hope our minds has been open to the possibilities, and considering the current shrinking civic space in Nigeria and across the world, I hope our minds have been open to strategies that we can use to ensure that corporations and businesses are part of the actions we want to take. So I'm going to call on my boss, Abby, to just give her final thoughts and wrap up the session in the absence of any further question or any further comments.
Please, can I say something before I become in?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, in some states where some corporate miners are violating the rights of host communities, and oftentimes either in partnership or with support of the government. What action can civil society organization take to bring such a company to book? The company may not be a multinational company. It could be. So I want to know where there is a violation of host communities' rights, and the company is also not opening up its space for the civil society to engage it in order to know what they are doing. What is the next best line of action for human rights defenders to take? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Akurifuku. I think Mr. Mauricio is still on the call, so if you want to share your thoughts on that, then Abby will add up her thoughts to how to give her wrap up.
I'll just take it together with my comments. Dr. Okezie, thank you for your question. I think what you're alluding to is where businesses themselves are and what can be done. I think that first of all, that the violations of this human rights should constitute crimes in your country, and that you can use the normal court processes or administrative processes. For example, you've mentioned host communities. For example, for mining host communities, would you consider sending a memo, a petition to the Ministry of Mines and Steel, reporting them to funding organizations, the African Development Bank, the FAO, ensuring that you're able to call them to accountability where it hurts them. And also, most companies will not like bad press. And so that if you will engage the media, that you may be able to get them to behave better in this instance. And of course, that civil society is also always willing to help host communities navigate conversations with companies, and where companies fail, that we're able to engage media, able to engage government, and where government is complicit, able to also engage international instruments and processes. That said, my first, I would like to thank Mauricio very much for joining this call and for sharing with us his wealth of wisdom. We think this is not the end of a conversation. This is actually the start of the conversation. We're happy, of course, to collaborate with the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability. As some of you on the call may know, this was an initiative that was started by Global Rights, and it's wonderful to see that it has taken a life of its own and is leading the discourse on business and human rights across the continent. We have a lot of work to do on the continent, not just the continent, across the globe. If only 3% of the world's population live in countries where civic freedoms are guaranteed or widespread, then we have an epidemic, a pandemic that is greater than COVID across the world. Our world is not healthy, not just physically in terms of COVID, but in terms of the respect for rights and freedoms. And that we must ensure that this conversation, this dialogue goes on till we're able to build a culture of rights, not just with civil society and movements, but with government and businesses. Businesses must learn to respect rights. Shell has done itself some of the greatest disservice for being complicit in the violation of rights in the Niger Delta. And they will forever have on their conscience the blood of the Ogoni Nine, and the 25th anniversary of the killings of the Ogoni Nine, that we remember not just the Ogoni Nine, but remember the atrocities in which Shell was complicit either by their silence or their active participation. And there are a number of organizations who have also lost credibility, which is something you may never be able to gain back, as Mr. Pampa said, once it is lost. That we need to think deeper about how businesses can be engaged, but also how civil society can engage businesses. Let's make this clear. When businesses say, oh, they're afraid of losing their licenses or favor with government, let's remind businesses that a lot of times as well, governments are afraid of businesses, particularly the large businesses. Now, if 42% of the global 100 most powerful economies, if 42 of them are businesses and just 58 are countries, it tells us that businesses are actually more powerful than countries. And I was engaged in a conversation with Lise just before the webinar had started to say that in a lot of countries, and as COVID will show, governments are businesses and businesses are the government. And then when they fail because of the interest of making profits, to take a stand for integrity, for a rights-based approach to dealing with issues, they tell us who they are rather than what they think that we think that they are, and that they must begin to redeem their images across the world. They need to think about not engaging government of countries or of provinces, but then also engaging world governments. Think of deeper engagements with the UN, with the World Bank, and think about rights-based approach to these institutions who definitely will not victimize them for having rights-based approaches. That we as civil society also need to think very deeply about how we engage businesses, that we're not asking them for money, that if their foundations are willing to fund civil society, perhaps we should think about the lines that we are willing to cross, but then no further, that we need to think deeply about how to also engage them in shuttle diplomacy between us and governments. How do you ensure backdoor conversations go on because we know that they have the ears of government, in spite of what the MTNs of this world would say and the image that is currently being portrayed, for example, with MTN and the Nigerian government, that MTN is still pretty influential in Nigeria. We need to think of businesses that are individuals as well, brands like Dangote, and how influential he is in not just the politics of Nigeria, but the socioeconomic setup of several countries across Africa. That said, that each of us need to think of ourselves as businesses and brands. Colin Kaepernick is not just a businessman, not just an athlete, but a brand in himself. And when he took that stand to kneel against the oppression that was going on in the United States, he put a lot of risk. Nike jumped on board to ensure that, to rally support behind him and to say that, you know what, just do you. You will remember the advert that Nike had come up with when most companies had turned their backs on Kaepernick. The byline in that advert had said that believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. And I think that businesses need to begin to think that way. And by the way, you will, as most people will know, and it might be a surprise for some people, that Nike actually won the Creative Arts Award of the Emmys for that year, because they believed in something enough to risk everything, and that their sales shot up radically after they came out with that support. That will we weigh the benefits of having a rights-based approach in our nation, in our world today, as opposed to towing the line and keeping behind and resulting in issues that we've had across countries. And like I said earlier, using the examples of what had happened in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and that you see the big companies, the multinational companies, the big diamond companies could do no business while the war lasted. There's a war against the civic space, and it will not just be against civil society actors. Like I said earlier, they are the canaries in the coal mine. This affects all of us. This is one for all and all for one. And this is a conversation we must continue to have till it becomes a culture. So thank you very much, Funke, for putting this meeting together. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you very much, Abby, for that. We're really so happy that we're able to eventually have this meeting at this time, and especially at the beginning of the year. You know, just like you had mentioned, this is the beginning of more conversations on this. We're very grateful to everyone who has joined us today and who has stayed till this time. Thank you very much, Aka. Dr. Benjamin, I don't know, he's not yet back in, but thank you very much, Aka. Thank you very much, Lies, for helping out with logistics and all of that. Thank you so much, Mr. Mauricio. We really, really did benefit from your wealth of experience today. Thank you very much once again, Abby. And we hope to keep the conversation coming. The recording of the webinar will be available. So if you need to listen again to just get some thoughts on what has been said, please do let us know. You can send us a mail. That will be all for now. So till we meet again, please do stay safe and stay well. Yes, it's a great way to start the year. Thank you very much, Mrs. Patumi. So have a very good day, everyone. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Funke. Good year ahead.